Hello and welcome to this special edition of Catholic Current. From Washington, D.C., I'm Mara Moser. As our nation marks its 250th year, we are discussing and celebrating the contributions of Catholics during our history. Today, with us to discuss the rich history of Catholics and American arts and letters are Katy Carl, a writer and editor of Luminor, Word on Fire's literary imprint, and Sarah Cortez, also a writer and the founder and president of Catholic Literary Arts in Houston, Texas. Welcome, Katy and Sarah. Thank you both for joining us. Today we are talking about the role that Catholics have played in American arts and letters. Both of you are writers yourselves. What do you think are some of the distinctive elements? Like, what makes Catholic art? Is there something that makes the work or filmmaker or something like that Catholic? Any distinctive elements?
A whole vibrant history of response to this question, and there are different takes depending on who you ask. There are non-Catholics who, in my belief, make Catholic art. There are Catholics who make quite secular art. You often have the same writer, Catholic or not, making secularized art in one instance and Catholic art in another. My answer to the question is there consonance between this individual piece of art and the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition? So not so much is the work about Catholics, because you can have a work about Catholics that's actually very secular in its tone and in its intention, or not necessarily is it written by a Catholic, because a Catholic can go in both lanes. I think for me the issue is the consonance. Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I think that's very important because Catholicism, as well as probably any deep faith tradition, sort of demands for us to have integrity, right? And if you're looking for integrity between the vision of reality that the artist or writer produces and a system of belief, then that consonance that you're speaking about has to be there. I think it's a very interesting question. What makes a work of art Catholic? We certainly have some wonderful sort of ideas that have been thrown out. As you mentioned, it's a very storied question and a very storied response. I think so. My principal form of writing tends to be poetry. And so I'm going to go for a poetic response, but I'm borrowing it from another wonderful poet that I wish to acknowledge, which is Sally Reed, in the introduction to her book From Word on Fire, 100 Best Catholic Poems. And in her beautiful introduction, and I encourage everybody to read it and read the poems in the book and think deeply about them. She says, when she was assembling this work and looking at several thousands of years of writing from great mystics, great saints, great authors, etc., she developed an intuition that she calls, does it beat with a Catholic heart? And then she further refines that. And this is not the time to go through all her beautiful refinements, but I think it's more than just a symbolism. Because we have this beautiful ordering of symbolism from our faith, the chalice, the bread and wine, the cross, etc. It's not just a symbolism. It's not just the attitude towards a symbolism, but it's partially the reality, the world we live in, viewed as a sacramental reality, and as everything ordered and framed leading back towards God. So all of this, but with beautiful additional nuances, and feels to me like the work has to do that. And in particularly, at least for me, as sort of a thinking reader and writer, we have to have that sense that the work or the protagonist, depending on poetry or fiction, etc., is wanting to get or trying to get back to God. because there's plenty of which Katy you've already referenced. There's plenty of instances where somebody can use a Catholic imagery and use Catholic quote unquote circumstances and really lead away.
Yeah, I think that's
But
a
I don't
great
know. I would love to
segue.
hear more from you. Sorry.
Oh, no, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Maura.
No, go right ahead. I'd love to hear more from you too, Katy.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. And I think the issue of the sacramental imagination is one that's worth raising up. That's something that has been spoken about a lot in recent years, both within and adjacent to the conversation on Catholic literature. And what does that mean exactly? I think it can mean a few things. I think there's something analogical to the sacramental order in the way that we use language to make absent realities present. But I think it's only an analogy, right? Language itself alone doesn't make a sacrament. As we know, as Catholics, there are also physical signs, symbols, realities that affect what they signify. Right. So I think sacramental literature in the largest sense is that which not only makes present what's absent, but makes credible the reality of the physical world as something that can mediate grace, right? And meaningfully mediate grace. And ultimately, it's a cosmos that operates as though it depended on the sacraments, which it does.
How do you both think about artists who may not be Catholic, but interact with the Catholic world? For example, someone like Willa Cather.
Yeah, Cather is one of those interesting corner cases, right? She's not herself Catholic, but she makes art sometimes that's more or less secular. You think about the short story Paul's Case, which is about a young man who essentially, tragically ends his life because he can't bear living in a world that's not beautiful all the time. And then you have Her Death Comes Through the Archbishop, which is this story of total submission to hardship and struggle and sort of transfiguration ultimately, and a revelation of beauty at the end, but not something that he sort of grasps for himself, but something that's given as a gift. It's not earned. It's pure grace. My Mortal Enemy is actually a little novella of Cather's that's an astonishing conversion story. It's wonderful. It's way under discussed. And I just, as a contemporary analog, maybe, I just finished reading Molly McNett's Child of These Tears, which is a novel out from Slant Books. And it follows a little girl in the early 1700s in what was called English America then. And she's kidnapped. Her whole family is attacked, and she's kidnapped by a tribe of warlike Native Americans. And then she's rescued by another tribe who are kind to her, take care of her frostbite and her to the dead of winter. And they hand her over to a French-speaking Jesuit mission in Canada to be cared for. And when she's there, she comes into the care of this awkward, overweight, humanly faulty, but absolutely golden-hearted priest who ends up being, for me, he's one of my favorite Catholic characters in any novel ever. He's written straight out of the Jesuit tradition, the Jesuits who came to evangelize in the 16th and 17th centuries on this continent. And McNett is not a Catholic writer, but she has so much respect for her sources and so much respect for the history that she's written a profoundly Catholic book. So that's an example that comes to my mind. Sarah, what about you?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, Willa Cather is one of my absolutely favorite authors. I can't even tell you how many times I've read Death Comes for the Archbishop. Um, the thing I love about Cather is her close, uh, well, first of all, was a deeply thoughtful author. Um, and that deep thoughtfulness and her finely attuned sensibility, not just to words and putting together words to create art, which she considered her fiction art, as opposed to her journalism, which was she considered not as art, but journalism. Um, that thoughtfulness that she brings extends to the way she portrays physical reality, and also the human nature. And I find both of those characteristics in her novels, particularly that particular one, that's my favorite novel, deeply deeply resonant with uh, the human desire to be close to God. So I think we desire to be close to God within our nature, that the location of the soul, uh, the proper, location of so much of what God does for us. But we also desire, I believe, naturally in the outside world. I'm going to point outside my window here. Uh, that reality brings us closer to God. That's part of the gift of creation. It's not just a tree. There is a transcendental meaning or existence, if you will, to the tree and how it can function and what it reveals to us as a nature of God. But I think Cather's study of the role of the missionary and is just profoundly uh, uh, it's profoundly nuanced. It's very human, and I think it's very illustrative of some of the best of the writing of St. John Paul II, because he wrote extensively on the role of the missionary priest.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean the human religious impulse is just so deeply ingrained in us. It's part of our nature. You would be surprised, I think, if you didn't get people who wrote from outside the tradition, but in ways that
Mhm.
resonated with it from within. And I bet you see this in poetry, Sarah, much more than I do, and all the time, all over the place, right?
Yes, and I think that's one of the great gifts of poetry is poetry doesn't contain the same freight of responsibility that prose contains, even though we do have some very poetic uh, fiction writers and have had, for centuries. But poetry is allowed to exist in this space that's closer to mystery, I believe. And it's allowed not to solve all the mysteries. And so, forgive us, Mara, we're just like going into this space of the deep, you know,
I'm with you.
the
I'm
po
with you.
the
Yeah.
poetic joys of of getting close to the mystery but
Mhm.
not solving it, because ultimately, I think, and in fact I love this as somebody who grew up Catholic, left for a long time, joyously came back many years ago. I love the fact that I don't have to solve the mystery of the incarnation. It's a mystery. It has to do with God. He is divine. He is so far above my piddly little human understanding. Anyway, and I think poetic language and a well done, well crafted poem really uh, can uh, put in a bundle for the reader some of that mysterious content, and we might get a shiver of recognition if we think we're getting close to the truth or a truth, but there's still always a little bit of a question mark. Anyway.
Yeah, that's, I love how you put that. I think poetry gets to dwell in mystery is going down into my commonplace book. Because I've written before about the differences, right? How I talk about fiction, I think of it as a common art, right? It's something that's sort of woven in and out of every day, almost like cooking, right? Where poetry lives in that space closer to liturgy. You can even integrate poetry in the liturgy in the way that you cannot integrate prose, should not integrate human prose, right? The prayers of the Mass are themselves the poetry of the Church. But at the same time, because you get to live with the unresolved in poetry, and this maybe leads into our next question a little bit. I wonder, among poets, do you seem to see more artists who have grown up Catholic but develop complicated relationships to the church as adults, and they're working this out through their art?
Mhm.
Well, I think there's never a shortage of human. all of us humans trying to work out, for those of us that are moved to be poets on the written page, trying to work out those complications. And uh, I think it is for the reader to discern carefully which poems are going to support uh, that reader's goal. Because some readers may have the goal of uh, sort of spiritual movement forward along the pilgrim journey of life. Some readers may have the goal of more enjoyment or intellectual challenge. Some readers may have the goal of just understanding uh, a certain period within the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I think what poetry can offer any and all that, and even more. But what it can hone your attention to incarnation. I mean, I early in my career, I was a fiction writer, was first published in fiction, and I attended an art opening and wandered into the museum bookstore and found a book by Jimmy Santiago Baca, uh, who we would not necessarily pick up as a Catholic poet by any means, an incredible contemporary American poet. Um, but the way he talked about his reality growing up in the barrio, completely, it just like flipped a switch on me. It was like I have to become a poet, so another great gift. But anyway, I'm sort of meandering, so I'm going to turn the baton back to Katy.
Yeah, I think what you're highlighting is that writers, whatever their relationship to a tradition of belief, they're focusing on human experience. And in that focus on human experience, they can teach us things that, as believers, we need to know about the standard to which we need to hold ourselves and others. I think a lot about what Dana Gioia says about the three different types of Catholic writer in his
Hmm.
little essay, "The Catholic Writer Today," this huge, influential essay, "The Catholic Writer Today." There's one type of writer who's more, Sarah, where you and I are, where you're writing both within and toward the fullness of the faith, and you're trying to make art, but you're trying to make art that sort of expresses what you've been given in that milieu. There's the cultural Catholic, whose imagination remains deeply shaped and formed by Catholicism and its structures and teachings, who maybe never made any kind of dramatic exit from the church, he says, but who drifted or is living it somewhat at a distance now. And then there's a third type of Catholic writer, still counts as a Catholic writer, uh, might want to call this an anti-Catholic Catholic writer who's is standing in an antagonistic relationship toward the visible church, but still very much preoccupied and embroiled with it. And we might extrapolate and identify more types, but I think all three of these are worth studying. And I also think that as Catholics, we should study non-Catholic writers rather than sort of making a hermetically sealed and separate literary culture, which wouldn't be desirable, or trying to dominate the mainstream, which wouldn't be desirable either. But trying to be a creative minority within, and sometimes maybe sort of a gadfly toward that mainstream culture, forcing it to consider and writing from within the human experience of belief and what that is and what it means and what problems it poses for you and what gifts it gives.
I absolutely agree, Katy. And actually, as you're speaking, it's reminding me of the introduction to that beautiful religious sister of a previous era, Sister Mariella Gable, Benedictine sister who became so famous for not only coaching many of her students at a very small college to win national writing awards, but for publishing uh, three collections, three anthologies of quote unquote Catholic short stories in the late 40s and 1950s here in America. And one of the points that she makes, and I think this is, I mean, the introductions to these volumes are just priceless. Sister Mariella had a wonderul personality, and her introductions just sort of sizzle with energy and opinion, well-founded opinion. But one of the points she makes is uh, how exciting it was for her as she's collected these short stories, which are quote unquote Catholic short stories. So they're written by somebody who has some kind of relationship with the faith, but they're more, she calls them, they're more than sociological. They have a transcendent element. And she sort of acknowledges the authors, but almost all of these stories at that time, I don't think it would be, well, it definitely wouldn't be the same now. At that time, most of these stories were actually published in secular magazines. So the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and so forth. But she really said this is so exciting because we as Catholics need to be, and our writing needs to be in the greater, out in the world.
Right. I've worked, as you know, in the past as a volunteer on the staff of a Catholic magazine, intended to you know, expand the conversation about the good, true, and beautiful, make the Catholic viewpoint available and accessible for readers who might not otherwise encounter it, and also to foster conversation within Catholic spaces about how we propose what we believe in a way that's positive, right? And in a way that's affirming of life and of experience and of beauty and goodness and truth. The founder, Bernardo Aparicio of Dappled Things, has a saying, if it's true, it's Catholic, right? And again, that can make us very appealing, very winsome within mainstream or secular spaces. And that can make possible the kind of interpenetration that was maybe common at mid-century, and I would argue is starting to be common again. We have, current living, working, young, National Book Awardees, major prize-winning authors in the United States right now who are working from within the Catholic perspective. We have a Nobel Prize honoree very recently, Catholic convert Jan Fosse, was given the Nobel Prize in Literature for 2013, or 20, forgive me, that's a decade off, for 2023. And every audience, secular and religious, so far has received his major work, Septology, with sort of open arms, right? And again, because he's tapping very deeply into what it is to be human, what it is to be a believer, and what it is to live these things out and to experience the tensions that you experience, and to to see the things that you see. Interestingly, his protagonist in that work is a Catholic artist. Just by detailing sort of daily experiences, both material and spiritual, of this person, and delving deeply into his memories, this character, we get the sense of a whole identity, even though in other ways that identity, he's thinking of the time, during the plot of the story where his life was very different than it is at the time when the story is being told. So there's a switching back and forth between the background and the foreground, and it's almost as if we have two different characters in this one character, right? That sort of radical difference that belief makes is very immediately present, and yet even readers who are not themselves believers have been able to resonate with that experience of of radical difference and radical change in the person you used to be versus the person that you are now. I think there's every reason to think that we should again be able to attain the kind of influence on literary culture, even if that means that we're also being shaped in part by literary culture. I don't think that that's something to be afraid of or to shy away from. I think we, in some cases, may even have something of a calling to that. So it's worthwhile for secular audiences to read Catholics. It's worthwhile for Catholic audiences to read secular writers, and vice versa.
Yeah, I'd like to
one of the oh
yeah. No,
go ahead, Maura.
yeah, I would like to ask, because we do want to focus on American artists, particularly those who are Catholic, and there are some who are very famous. like Flannery O'Connor, who hasn't come up yet in this conversation, although I do think you mentioned Wise Blood earlier. Some who are very famous. What about some Catholic American artists who may be less known?
Well, what I would offer sort of comes from my background in Mexican American studies. So I was a visiting scholar for 2 years at the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Houston. Exciting time working with their undergraduates in creative writing. Uh, and sort of, so one of the strains I would tease out, I look forward to its further development, but one of the strains that I would tease out is in Mexican American literature in the US, uh, the, the, there was early on established a very large tradition of the daily journal or the memoir, and that's because of the religious brothers or friars who came over with the Spaniards to New Spain, and that persistent interest in the individual life, in the details of an individual life, and the life journey has maintained itself very strong in both memoir as well as sort of fictionalized accounts within the Mexican American tradition. So I actually think some of the not very well known authors, but who sort of are going along that particular path or that particular journey. San Antonio native, unfortunately no longer with us, but San Antonio native Arcadia Lopez, and her book Barrio Teacher is an extremely fine example of faith, a life of faith and a life of service. Um, I think some of the very interesting fiction that could go along with this is Tomas Rivera and The Earth Did Not Swallow Him, books like this. And then sort of on an interesting sort of reversal, there's a lot of Mexican American authors who have gotten very interested in the Aztec mythology. And uh, so I'm going to, without just going into the aspects of what was wrong with it and, sort of some of the more horrific manifestations that we all know about, I would like to acknowledge American Book Award winner Graciela Limon and her historical fiction, The Song of the Hummingbird. So these are all Mexican American authors who were born, grew up in the United States, and uh, and have well acknowledged careers as writers.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I would also add maybe two under recognized writers whose names don't come up necessarily and as part of the round of usual suspects when you talk about the more recent eras of American Catholic fiction. But they're two of my favorites. Richard Bausch, who's been turning out quietly just utterly brilliant fiction since about 1980. His first novel is called Real Presence, and is about, it's very much an Appalachian diary of a country priest. He has an award-winning novel from 2009 called Peace, about soldiers toward the end of World War II. Tim Gautreaux is the other author, a Louisianian who's been published in Harper's, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Best American Short Stories. Faith can tend to be backgrounded in his work, which possibly is why we don't get as much attention on him in the Catholic circles, but he is a baptized cradle Catholic, and he's so good and so funny. And if you read Same Place, Same Things, which is his collection set in Louisiana among working people, you go read that and then come tell me to my face that there's nobody writing like Flannery O'Connor anymore. You can't do it. It's brilliant. It's just delightful. We have a very significant surge of younger new writers working both with smaller and with major publishers. I could rattle off quite a few, but the point is if you start looking, you'll you'll find, right? They're there.
Yeah, I'm thinking now of two poets because of my own participation for years in police work. I have a great interest in blue collar poets. So two blue collar poets that are Catholic in the work, the faith definitely appears as in their work. Michael Casey, Michael Casey, who won the Yale Younger Poets Prize for a volume of work written while he was a soldier in Vietnam. And then Jim Daniels, who taught for years creative writing at Carnegie Mellon.
Um, that's wonderful. We're going to turn just a little bit into a more of a historical approach. How has the place of Catholics in American art changed over the course of the past 250 or so years? Do you think, was there a time when Catholics were considered outsiders, or a time when Catholics and Catholic art was particularly admired?
So before the American founding, the only places you could go in the original 13 British colonies where you could reliably escape pervasive anti-Catholicism if you were a Catholic were to Maryland, which was founded by a Catholic and was intended as a haven for Catholic religious freedom. Or to parts of Pennsylvania where the Quakers just tolerated everybody. But that was not the norm before the First Amendment. The First Amendment's Establishment Clause is a tremendous gift, not only to Catholics, but to believers of so many other kinds in America. And religious freedom is a precursor, a prerequisite for any ability to contribute meaningfully and directly to culture. Now, it's interesting, the Catholic influence on early American literature. And early, I date from about 1850 with Nathaniel Hawthorne. We don't have a whole lot of very serious literary culture before that. You have a rich oral tradition of rhymes and legends and fairy tales from different cultures. And again, I don't intend to say that those things aren't serious, but when I'm talking about literacy and literate culture, that's what I mean when I say we didn't really have a culture of letters as much before that generation. Even Hawthorne and later Henry James were, very much imbibing the spirit of anti-Catholicism or suspicion toward Catholicism. But at the same time, these were really well-traveled men of the world, and they couldn't ignore that for many people, Catholicism was nourishing, it was sustaining. They could see that in the lives of actual people that they knew and respected, and they could see above all the beauty of Catholic art. They couldn't deny that. That was very much present to their imaginations, and it shows up in both of their work. So Catholic fates, literarily at least, and we might argue in the bigger picture as well, in America have pretty much followed the fates of immigrant communities. Toward the end of the 19th century, you see this surge of Italian and Irish immigration, mid to late 19th century. But it's a few generations before those communities become established enough and have developed institutions of their own and an intellectual culture of their own, robust enough that they can support creative communities. So to look at this more closely, there are a couple of historians I recommend. Jean Kellogg's The Vital Tradition has a wonderful chapter on the linkage between different old world influences on Catholic culture in the New World, and the ways that Catholic communities in the New World shaped themselves and formed themselves to that sort of prepared the way for the mid-century revival of Catholic letters that we're most familiar with, I think. Then Kevin Starr talks about this as well, and more even than Kellogg focuses on the foundation and the healthy life of Catholic institutions, the need in particular for really accurate, robust nonfiction writing in order for fiction writers, for poets to flourish. It is only when you have that you really have the arts and letters come to their full flowering in imaginative and poetic works. We saw that kind of groundswell in the 1950s and early 60s. I would argue, and I really believe and hope to see, we're going to have a similar groundswell. It's already begun, and who knows how long we can keep it going. I also think, speaking back to Sarah's point from earlier, that there's going to be a significant impact made by Hispanic and Latino writers in the 21st century on American Catholic creative culture. And that phenomenon is just, again, already started to some extent, but it's going to take off wildly, and I'm just really excited that we get to see it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Katy. I will say very briefly, the period that actually interests me the most because of various reasons is that groundswell of small Catholic magazines that actually publish literary work right there along with the ads for the rosaries, etc. During the 30s, 40s, 50s era. They sort of all died after the Vatican II era, or during that era they died. But we did have a more literate America. We're looking at an America right now. I think in 2024, over 54% of Americans cannot read above a sixth grade level, which just profoundly scares me. But we're just working to instill the joy, with people of all ages of reading, and joy calls to joy. So, but I am fascinated by how many religious sisters during the 40s and 50s and early 60s were published. And I'd like to mention the book by Nick Rapatrasone, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, on the religious sister poets specifically of that era. And because these ladies, they mostly wrote formal verse, and some people care for that and some people do not, but they were amazingly sophisticated poets, well published, and that whole sort of groundswell of education, interest in being literary. I mean, I'm close enough to that Vatican II era to remember that there was nothing that I felt I didn't participate in as a human being. In other words, I could have been one of those sailors on the ship looking for Moby Dick. I could have been one of the people who was, like Cabeza de Vaca. I could have been one of the Native American Indians that he encountered, that actually took him as a slave. I could have been any of those people because of our common shared humanity, which is one of the great gifts that Jesus Christ calls us again and again to remember. But that era, I think we're on the brink. There's so many new literary contests, new journals, exciting alliances and collaborations. And I want to see so many new people and younger people, and I mean high school and middle school, published. And anyway, I'm getting excited, so I'm rambling, so forgive me, but I'm going to turn it back to Mara.
Well, I guess I appreciate your excitement. Both of you have talked about kind of the hopeful future for Catholic art and letters in this country. I think we've covered most of our topics, but I did want to have a chance to give you both, if there's anything we haven't talked about that you would like to address. This series is part of a America 250 celebration here at the USCCB. Is there anything that we haven't touched on before we conclude? I could listen to you both talk about books all day, and I think I have a long list to write down when this ends to go look up at the library. But is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to share before we conclude today?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, well, I think I just want to maybe tie off a loose thread in something I said earlier and maybe correct a possible misinterpretation. I'm talking about the rise of literacy in America, of literate culture. I'm talking specifically about the writing considered as a fine art. Of course, we had, very parallel to what was present in England, an extremely high rate of literacy in America around the time of the founding, the Revolution, the coffee house culture, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. These kinds of more instrumental writing were extremely vibrant and were lively and influential. There's something about those that's deeply important and that we don't want to downplay. But I think when the dust settles and when things are peaceful again, right, there's a role that the arts and letters can play in pulling people back toward contemplation and back toward the center of life that is so vital, and that no pamphlet or no, even Bill of Rights or Constitution, right, can get us to that level. I want to come back again to what Sarah said about the role of poetry and and to some extent prose narrative as well, in helping us dwell with mystery. And this is, in an extremely fast-paced moment, very often conflicted moment in culture. This is something we desperately need, is to be able to dwell in our own center with ourselves and with God. And I think that literature, to some extent, can help us dispose ourselves in such a way that that's possible.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Beautifully said, Katie. And I would just add a little bit to that, which is that also gets me back to the mention of contemplative realism and the brilliant literary scholar and writer Joshua Wren, founder of Wise Blood Books. And that's why are we reading? Why are we writing? Why are we doing anything? The goal is to get to God. That is it. So I think we're so lucky at this point in time to have so many brilliant, but more than brilliant, uh, spiritual Catholic leaders such as Joshua Wren, such as James Matthew Wilson, who are spending their entire lives trying to create a culture where people not only gain the skill to be good writers and the experience of good reading to be good readers, but most importantly, they are being led to the idea that to really be a good writer, to be the best writer you can, that's a spiritual exercise. So there's all this internal work that in the best examples, we as writers are called to do, because that nobility of purpose that leads to God is what the whole point of everything is. And anyway, Katie, you might want to fine tune my expression on that, but I just think we're so lucky to have these great leaders among us.
That's beautifully said. Hear, hear.
Yeah.
Amen. My thanks to you both for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Likewise. God bless.
Likewise.
Thanks for having
Thank you,
us.
Katie. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for joining us for this special edition of Catholic Current. You can find out more about our ongoing celebration of America at 250 by visiting us online at usccb.org or follow us on social media at usccb. I'm Mara Moser. See you next time.